Hey kiddos, I hope you guys enjoyed that beautiful day that we had yesterday with no rain and all that beautiful sunshine. We've had some dreary weather the last couple days, and so I hope you got out in that. I hope this week you were able to meet up with your small group. And so just a reminder for the next couple weeks, we won't be meeting on Zoom Wednesday nights, but we'll be doing small groups individually led by your small group leader and scheduled by them. So if you don't know who your small group leader is, or you want to get plugged into one, but you haven't been a part of one, just shoot me a message or text me or email me or any of those. Send me an Instagram message, whatever, and I'll make sure that you get put into one. We can find you a small group leader to be meeting together. We're meeting in groups less than 10 and just spending time going through a Bible study together, but also just getting together and connecting. So if you're interested in that, let me know. But all of that is kind of leading up to our group gathering together. So I want to let you guys know this may change, but we are planning to kick off our summer and our group gatherings by heading to Chicken and Pickle on Thursday, June 4th. And so it's going to be $5, and we'll have pickleball, shuffleboard, bocce ball, and we'll be doing some appetizers. So if you want different food or drinks, you can bring money for that. But plan to join us. Talk to your parents. It's okay for us to meet in a setting like that, but we want your parents to be comfortable. We want you to be comfortable with being around other people. And so check with them. But that's our plan. June 4th, Chicken and Pickle as a group. We're going to go there and hang out. And so that's our first time that we'll be back together. I'm really excited for that. But this week, we're continuing on with week 2 of our series, Blurry. And so last week, we looked at a story in Matthew 14 of Jesus inviting Peter to walk on the water with him. And at first, it was great, right? Until he got distracted and he started to sink. And so as we think about the big things in our lives, the struggles or the doubts that we have, and whenever we take our eyes off of Jesus, when we quit talking about our struggles or our doubts with our friends, with our small group leaders, with our parents, it's in that moment that we start to sink. And so last week, I asked you to think of what it would look like for you amidst suffering, amidst your doubts, instead of focusing on those things, to focus on Jesus instead. And to worship, to investigate your doubt, and I challenged you to try for the next time when you start going towards that doubt and facing those things, that in that start thinking about Jesus. What does that look like? To think about Jesus and being with you and asking you to follow him in those moments and not to be distracted. So this week, we're following it up with what happens when even after we see God be powerful and do amazing things in our life, what happens when we face opposition? And so now when we look at the storyline of the Bible, God had a plan to show his love to the world through a certain group of people. And so if you guys remember, it started with Abraham and his family, and then Jacob and his 12 sons, and it eventually became the entire family line, the people of Israel. And so if you remember, before Israel was a place like we know it, the people, they were slaves. And do you remember how long they were slaves for? I think 400 years they were slaves. So we often tell you to put yourself in the story when we're reading the Bible, to get it in the context of the story. This time I want you to take yourself out of the context of the story and put yourself in the context of an American. So as Americans, 400 years, what does that mean to us? Independence Day was 1776. That was the year of Independence Day that we gained our freedom as Americans. So if you take when we started ourselves as an American nation, up until now, add about another 150 years, that's how long the Israelites had been slaves in Egypt. Isn't that crazy? Like, you're an Israelite and your family, they've been a family and a nation, and you've been captive and you've been slaves for 400 years. And then all of a sudden, you're following this guy who says he's been told by God to lead you out of Egypt. And so you follow him because he does some pretty rad miracles, right? Making the Nile turn to blood, casting locusts and frogs, all these things. So you're following him, and the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, says that you can go. And you can't believe it, and you're free. And so you're following Moses, this guy, and you come to the ocean and you're following this huge pillar of smoke and fire that's the presence of God. And Pharaoh and his army, they're all of a sudden behind you, coming to attack you. They set you free, and now they're chasing you, and there's no place for you to go because you're stuck at the sea. But all of a sudden, that pillar of fire and smoke, they go between you and the Egyptians and protect you. And overnight, the sea parts and creates a path for you to walk through the sea. Now, this isn't some like Santa Fe Lake to walk through, right? Like this was a sea, miles and miles of water that were parted. And as you're walking through it with your slave masters chasing you behind you, the waters close in and cause that army to drown. Can you imagine the unbelief, the being mystified, and yet the joy at the freedom that you have won, that God has won for you? The happiness, the excitement to worship that God that freed you and saved you. But can you imagine that you doubted God again? You wanted to do your own way, and so you have to wander the desert for 40 years. And finally, you get to this place that God has promised you, a place with food and provision that'll not run out, it'll last for forever. That's what God's promised you. And that's where we find ourselves. So that was a little blurb into where we find ourselves in this story. And we'll be in Numbers 13. So we'll start out with this. Numbers 13, 1-2 says this. The Lord said to Moses, send some people to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. For each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders. So the Israelites were supposed to send some men to explore the land that God had promised the Israelites. Then we skip to Numbers 13, verses 25 through chapter 14, verses 4. It says this. At the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. And there they reported to them that the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here's its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan. Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses, and he said, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had explored. They said, the land we explored, it devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are great giant sized. We saw the Nephilim were there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. And we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Chapter 14 says, that night, all the members of the community, they raised their voices and they wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and our children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. We've heard this story before. The Israelites over and over and over again continued to doubt God, to not trust, to fall in the face of those giants that they faced literally in this story, and they wanted to go back to being slaves, to 400 years of being slaves. It's crazy. I think there's three key things and truths that we can see in this passage that shows us about trusting God in the face of opposition. The first one is this. It's that God invites us to fight evil even when he's already promised victory. God had told the Israelites that he was going to bring them into the land, to make it theirs, and yet they doubted him. But he still invited them into what he's doing. I think about that. Wouldn't you want to be a part of what the all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God is doing, especially in the face of a challenge and opposition? Don't you want to be a part of that rather than on the outside or doing it yourself? I sure would be. And how much more confident should we be to know that God is fighting for us and has promised us victory? That's something that Jesus has told us, that we will have victory even in the end. Even when we face opposition, even when we face tribulation and persecution for believing in Jesus, for following him, for doing what God has called us to do, we know that in the end, we are promised victory. So God invites us to fight even when he's almost already promised victory. That's a good thing. The second truth is that scary truths don't have to cause us to fear. So maybe that sounds a little confusing. Although we face scary truths, they don't have to cause us to fear. The reality in this story is that there were giants in the land. So many of Israel's enemies to defeat, all in one place. But one view was that they were impossible to defeat. But Caleb's perspective was that the Israelites were stronger than these enemies. That with God on their side, the scary things in this life didn't have to cause them to fear. I believe that's why when we hear of people who are sick, people who are dying, they're not afraid. When their trust is in Jesus, there is something fearful. That is scary. I get scared thinking about death. But these people have shown us as well that death is a reality, it's a truth, and it can be scary, but we don't need to fear it. What in your life overwhelms you? What causes you to fear? I'm not saying those things that cause you to fear aren't scary, but I'm telling you that we don't have to be afraid. Our lives do not have to resound with fear and wailings as if we should go back to slavery. No, pursuing Jesus, loving God, doing what he's called us to do. We don't have to fear even when it looks like it doesn't make sense, even when we are led into this scary land with scary giants that look like they will destroy us. God has told us that he loves us and he'll care for us through it. We don't have to be afraid. And that leads us to number 3. God gives us a choice to doubt or to trust. So it all kind of comes down to this. When we face the giants in our life, we have a choice. Do we doubt? Do we succumb to the fear that can overwhelm us? Or do we trust in the one who is more powerful than us and leads us into knowing that he will be with us and love us in the midst of it? It makes me kind of think of this story, all of this doubt and giants and facing opposition. It reminds me of the story of the 1980 Olympic Games. So the United States hockey team, it was made up mostly of college kids, right? So probably 18 to 22 years old. And they faced the greatest team in the world, the Soviet Union's Olympic team. So not only was the American team younger, smaller, and less experienced than the Soviet Union team, but they had been outscored by that team 10 points to 3 a few weeks earlier when they played them. That's hockey. Rarely do you ever get to a score of 10. But though they had every reason to doubt, to fear in the midst of that, the team of hockey players, they trusted their coach. His name was Herb Brooks. And before this big game that they were playing the Soviet Union in the semifinals of the Olympics, before this game, he said this. Herb Brooks said, "You were meant to be here, and this moment is yours." And this crazy thing is, he was right. So the American team won 4-2, and they won the next game against Finland to win the gold medal for the first time in decades. When the game ended, the game's broadcaster, Al Michaels, he's a famous sports broadcaster, he famously asked, "Do you believe in miracles?" This is all shown in a really good movie that I love. It's actually a movie called Miracle. So it tells this story, and if you want to watch it, go watch it. It's a good movie, maybe for a family movie night. But this was a real life example of young men who were facing giants, who were facing opposition, who were facing things in their lives that were scary and should have caused them to fear, and yet they stood up in the face of it and they overwhelmed it. John R. Stott, he said this: faith is a reasoning trust, a trust which reckons thoughtfully and confidently upon the trustworthiness of God. So your trust that you have, it reckons, it has to find itself confidently put upon the trustworthiness of what God has said he will do. Do you believe that God can save you? Do you believe that God can overwhelm those giants in your life? Obviously, it's these metaphors that they're kind of silly for us, right? But at the same time, we face a lot of things. Is it depression? Is it anxiety? Is it temptation? Is it pornography? Like, there's all these things that face us, that cause us to want to go away from God, to turn away from God, to turn to ourselves, to trust ourselves. And yet God says, in the face of all of these things, trust me. They're big, they're scary, but you don't have to fear. Trust me. I want to encourage you guys. What are those things in your life? What's something you're holding on to? Is it your future? Is it relationships? Is it doubt in God himself? Is it anxiety? Is it fear of going for a job, of trying out for something, of doing something? Are you just fearful of it? Do you need to be? Can you trust that God's going to be with you even if you don't make it through that? Even if you don't get the job, even if the relationship doesn't end up how you thought it would, are you still trusting God in the midst of it? This week, I encourage you, it's not always easy. It's not easy to keep our eyes on Jesus and to trust in God in the midst of facing opposition. But I encourage you, try it. See what happens. God always shows up in the way that he wants to. Maybe not in the way that you do, but God does always show up. I love you all, and I'm looking forward to the time that we get to have together soon. See ya.